The Grand Hall of Velthar Prime was a monument to peace carved into crystal spires that reached toward the stars. Delegates from 27 species stood beneath its arched dome, each cloaked in their cultural pride, each expecting another long day of posturing and polite negotiations. Humanity arrived last. Commander Alina Voss led the Earth delegation. She wore a simple navy blue uniform with no medals, no ornamentation, just a silver emblem on her chest, a globe surrounded by a ring of stars. Her expression was unreadable, but her steps echoed with purpose as she crossed the floor to the central podium. The Zorveni Imperium waited there already. Tall, armored, and predatory in posture, High Marshal Vorak stood flanked by his war ministers. The Zorvani were not diplomats. They had come not to discuss terms, but to dictate them. The Imperium has no need for further negotiation, Vorak said, his voice deep and resonant. Earth will surrender its independent systems and demilitarize. Refusal will be considered an act of defiance, and defiance is war. A hush fell over the room. Some delegates whispered nervously. Others leaned forward, watching. Elena didn't move at first. She simply studied Vorak, as if examining an artifact behind glass. Then she stepped forward, her voice low but clear. "Is that your opening statement?" she asked. A demand wrapped in threat. "It is a mercy," Vorak replied. "You have no fleets, no ancient weapons. You are a flicker. The galaxy will not miss your extinguishing." Elena's silence stretched. The delegation behind her shifted uneasily, but she remained still. Then, without raising her voice, she said the words that would become legend. "You want war?" she asked. "Then brace yourself for one you'll never survive." The entire chamber seemed to inhale at once. Vorak blinked, unsure he heard correctly. Around the room, interpreters repeated the phrase in every tongue, every dialect, and it landed like a shockwave. Some laughed nervously. Others stared at the human commander in stunned silence. "You would threaten the Imperium," Vorak growled. "No," Elena replied. "I'm telling you what comes next." She turned from the podium, nodded once to her aides, and walked away. Just like that. No bluster, no warning shots, just a statement and an exit. Outside the chamber, her team fell in step behind her. "Commander," her aide whispered, barely suppressing a grin, "that line's going to echo across the galaxy." Elena didn't smile. "Let them echo it," she said. "We've just declared a war they think they understand." Inside the Grand Hall, the Zorveni were still frozen in disbelief. The galaxy had expected another minor species to bow. Instead, it had just met humanity, and humanity had drawn the line. The galaxy's laugh echoed in the corridors of the Zorvani warships as they turned away from Velthar Prime. Humanity, they said, was nothing more than a young species, too naive to understand the price of resistance. The Zorvani High Command dismissed the Earth delegation as an irritation, a minor hiccup in their grand conquest. Their fleet would soon be in Earth's orbit, and the humans would be forced to kneel. But there was one thing the Zorvani didn't know. Humanity was not intimidated by the unknown. It thrived in it. Back on Earth, the response was far from the panic the Zorvani expected. News outlets buzzed with the words of Commander Elena Voss, her image flashing on screens across the globe. But it wasn't fear in their eyes. It was determination. "We did not start this," she had said in her broadcast, "but we will finish it." While the rest of the galaxy debated the wisdom of a human resistance, Earth's leaders had already activated Project Goliath, a highly classified initiative for asymmetric warfare. This was not just about the military. It was about thinking differently, about using everything. For months, Earth had been building what the rest of the galaxy would never expect. Earth did not have the fleets or the firepower of the ancient empires, but what it did have were brains and a resolve harder than steel. Project Goliath had been designed with one goal in mind, not to defeat the Zorveni directly, but to outsmart them at every turn. No single strike would be enough to break the Zorvani's iron grip, but 1,000 small cuts. That would do the trick. While the Zorveni assembled their fleet, human engineers worked in secret, converting old mining stations and derelict satellites into stealth drones, each one capable of disrupting the Zorveni's advanced sensors. Their spaceships might be larger, but the humans knew how to play on a different scale, one the Zorveni could never understand. And it wasn't just technology. Humanity also brought something else to the table: psychological warfare. The first Zorveni ships that entered human space were greeted not by guns or missiles, but by complete silence. No communications, no sign of human presence. Nothing but empty space. It was eerie, and the Zorvani's impatience grew as they pushed deeper into Earth's territory. Then the first trap sprung. A Zorveni cruiser sent a transmission back to their fleet, declaring a breakthrough. But as soon as it did, a sudden burst of electromagnetic pulses scrambled its systems. Within seconds, the ship's engines shut down, and it drifted aimlessly, disabled, floating in space like a giant, helpless corpse. The Zorveni were stunned. The technology they had ignored, old, human-made drones, had just crippled their flagship. And this was just the beginning. The humans weren't fighting with raw strength. They were fighting with cunning precision and the ruthless ingenuity that had allowed them to survive against impossible odds for centuries. Humanity wasn't playing by the rules. They were rewriting them. And that was the moment when the galaxy started to take notice. The Zorveni fleet moved deeper into the solar system, their ships advancing with military precision. They expected to encounter human resistance, brash, last-ditch efforts to defend a weak species. Instead, they found nothing. For the first few days, it felt like a game of cat and mouse. Zorveni commanders began to suspect that humanity had simply abandoned its colonies, that Earth's defenses were either non-existent or hidden in the depths of the solar system. But even that didn't explain the eerie silence. The first signs of trouble came when a Zorveni cruiser, the Perdition's Wrath, vanished without a trace. One minute, it was on course to take orbit around Mars, and the next, it simply disappeared. No distress signal, no debris, just empty space. The Zorveni tried to contact the ship, but there was no response. They sent another vessel to investigate, but it found only static. It was as if the Perdition's Wrath had been erased from existence. Panic rippled through the fleet. A few days later, another ship, the Bloodhowl, suffered a similar fate, this time during a routine scouting mission near Earth's outer belt. As it ventured close to a cluster of asteroids, an explosion shook the ship. Not from a missile or any known weapon, but from an unexpected source, a kinetic bombardment. The rocket collided with had been transformed into a weapon, carefully aimed and devastatingly effective. Yet the Zorveni could not retaliate. They couldn't identify the threat, let alone counter it. The humans weren't fighting the way the Zorveni expected. There were no large-scale battles, no space stations manned with cannons, no fleets to outgun them. The humans had simply disappeared. Human technology had always been about efficiency, about adaptability, and now the Zorveni realized they had overlooked the most dangerous weapon humanity possessed: the ability to blend into the environment, to use the very stars themselves as a shield. As the days wore on, the Zorveni began to notice subtle things. Communications between ships started to degrade. Routine scans yielded false information. Time after time, their ships collided with asteroids or invisible traps. Resources began to dwindle. It wasn't until the Zorveni fleet reached the asteroid belt that they encountered a human fleet, an entire fleet of decoys, disguised as space debris. When the Zorveni opened fire, they realized too late that their targets were not human ships but replicas, old mining vessels, rusted-out freighters with just enough equipment to appear real. They'd been lured into a trap, only to find themselves wasting precious resources on targets that didn't exist. The true threat remained elusive. The humans, it seemed, were everywhere and nowhere. A sense of unease began to settle in the Zorveni ranks. What was worse than an enemy fleet that couldn't be seen? One that could always be one step ahead. The Zorveni had always prided themselves on being apex predators. Their empire stretched across galaxies, Built on the backs of ruthless tactics, their enemies crushed under the weight of their superior firepower. They had fought and conquered for centuries, leaving shattered worlds in their wake. Now, for the first time, they were facing something they couldn't hunt, something they couldn't even identify. Commander Malkor, the Zorveni's chief strategist, stood in his private quarters, staring at the star charts. The humans had proven elusive, but that wasn't what disturbed him. It was the psychological toll their war tactics were taking on his fleet. Every day, more and more ships went missing without a trace. The reports from his commanders were filled with uncertainty and fear. There were no clear engagements, no battles with explosions or fire. Just empty space, followed by sudden, unexpected losses. The entire fleet was on edge. One evening, Malkor called for a private meeting with his top officers. They were seated in a war room, dimly lit, the walls lined with tactical maps. Vorak, the High Marshal, stood at the head of the table, his once confident posture now stooped with frustration. "The humans are not engaging us in the way we expect," Malkor said, his voice cold but strained. "They don't follow our rules of engagement. They don't have the firepower to challenge us directly, but they're destroying our morale." "You are suggesting we retreat?" Vorak asked, his voice clipped. "We cannot lose face before the galaxy." "No," Malkor replied. "I'm suggesting we're facing something far more dangerous than we anticipated. We're facing an enemy that doesn't care about conventional warfare." There was a long silence. Then one of the junior officers spoke up, his voice trembling. "We've been outmaneuvered, but it's more than that. We're being stalked. We're being hunted." Vorak glared at the officer. "Explain yourself." The young officer hesitated but then continued, "It's like they're everywhere and nowhere. It's not just the attacks, it's the silence. The way they make us feel as though we're always walking into a trap. We're the ones being hunted, not the other way around." A shiver of realization swept through the room. The Zorveni had always seen themselves as the hunters, but now they were the ones being stalked. A species with no ships, no weapons, nothing tangible, and yet they could cripple entire fleets by forcing the Zorveni to play their game. One they didn't understand. "They're not just playing with us," Malkor muttered. "They're forcing us to become the prey." The tension in the room was palpable. A growing sense of dread filled every corner of the war room. How long could they last against an enemy who understood fear so well, who could manipulate it with such ease? The Zorveni had never been the hunted, but now, for the first time in their history, they realized they were facing a species that could turn the hunter into the hunted. The Zorveni had no idea how to respond to what was happening. They couldn't catch their elusive enemy, couldn't predict their next move, and every plan they tried seemed to fall apart as soon as it was put into motion. The once confident warriors of the Zorveni Imperium now found themselves trapped in a war they didn't understand, and fear was creeping in faster than they could admit. In the midst of their growing confusion, a transmission was sent out across the galaxy. It wasn't a military broadcast, nor a call to arms. It was a message from Commander Elena Voss, and it would echo through the stars like a thunderclap. The transmission was simple, calm, and measured. "We did not start this war," Elena's voice resonated across countless worlds, "but we will finish it. You think we are weak, unworthy of your attention. That was your mistake, and you will learn from it." The message was broadcast simultaneously on multiple frequencies and languages, accessible to every species that had a foothold in the galaxy. For those who had laughed at Earth's involvement in the war, it was a moment of intense shock. But it wasn't just the words that hit hard, it was the timing. The moment the transmission finished, humanity unleashed a synchronized assault on multiple systems at once. 6 entire sectors, unprotected and seemingly forgotten by the Zorveni, erupted into chaos. Ships that had been presumed to be abandoned flickered back to life, and civilian mining platforms that had been written off as insignificant suddenly launched a flurry of offensive operations. The human strategy was not based on firepower, it was based on disruption. Entire communication networks fell silent. Zorveni military outposts were hacked, their systems rendered useless. Human-made drones and automated ships, long thought to be of no importance, now turned into ghost fleets, launching surprise attacks and forcing Zorveni warships into retreat. In a remote corner of Zorveni space, a Zorveni destroyer commander, Captain Lornak, watched in disbelief as his fleet's navigation system failed again. Every attempt to regain control only led to further disarray. No missiles, no ships in sight, just disabling chaos. But what was truly terrifying was that they still couldn't understand how it was happening. How had humanity learned to fight like this? As the Zorveni fleet regrouped, trying to salvage what little they could, they were met with another unexpected transmission. This one wasn't from Alina Voss, but from the humans themselves. Ordinary people from all walks of life standing in front of cameras, offering their thoughts directly to the galaxy. "We've all learned something today," one human farmer said. "You came to kill us, but all you've done is teach us how to survive. And when it's over, you'll wish you'd never drawn a line in the sand with us." It was humanity's collective defiance, their unified resolve. It wasn't a military statement. It was a declaration of identity. No longer would they be the galaxy's underdog. No longer would they shrink in the shadow of others' power. The message was clear. Humanity didn't need to conquer the galaxy. They had already won by showing that they were not the prey. The Zorveni fleet had entered Earth's orbit with fire in their hearts. They thought they had calculated every move, every potential defense. They believed the humans would crumble in the face of their overwhelming might. But what they found wasn't a desperate resistance. It was a calculated, cold precision that unnerved them. The humans had never fought with brute strength. Their strategy was more insidious. They had turned the environment itself into a weapon. They weren't fighting with missiles or massive fleets. They were using the very stars to manipulate the battlefield. The first sign that the Zorveni were in deeper trouble than they realized came when they tried to take orbit around Earth. Their lead battleship, the Vermilion Ring, broke through the atmosphere as expected, but before it could complete its descent, it was caught by a field of disruptive energy that caused its sensors to fail. What followed was unlike anything the Zorveni had prepared for. Hundreds of satellites, seemingly dormant for years, activated simultaneously, redirecting solar energy toward the Zorveni ships. The rays focused in blinding beams, overpowering the Zorveni's sensor systems, frying their instruments in a series of precise, devastating pulses. The Zorveni ships found themselves blind, their advanced targeting systems reduced to useless flashes. And then the mirrors came to life. What seemed like a random scattering of mining stations and old debris in space were, in fact, intricately designed reflectors, configured to bounce solar flares and laser beams with deadly accuracy. These mirrors, once thought to be nothing more than space junk, were now directing focused beams of concentrated energy directly into the Zorveni fleet. They weren't just weapons. They were a message. Humanity had turned their environment into a death trap. Zorveni commanders scrambled to figure out what was happening, but it was too late. Their ships had already sustained critical damage, their once imposing fleet crumbling under the relentless barrage of invisible, undetectable assaults. Their systems couldn't keep up with the speed and efficiency of the human counterattacks. The Vermilion Ring was the first to fall. Its shields, weakened by the solar pulses, collapsed under the weight of another energy pulse. It exploded in a brilliant flash, sending debris flying into the void. The destruction wasn't just a loss of a ship. It was a psychological blow. The Zorveni had been bested, and they knew it. With their most advanced ship destroyed, the remaining Zorveni vessels tried to retreat, but the damage was already done. They were no longer the predators. They were the prey, running in confusion from an enemy they couldn't comprehend. Human eyes, which had been silently analyzing every move, predicted their retreat, and human drones intercepted every escape route. There was nowhere left to run. As the remnants of the fleet scattered, Zorveni commanders received an encrypted message, a final broadcast. It was simple, but it was enough. "We don't need to destroy you to beat you," Alina Voss's voice echoed. The Zorveni were broken. The war was no longer about who had the most firepower. It was about who had the will to win. and humanities will have just rewritten the rules. The galaxy had never seen anything like it. The Zorveni Imperium, once an unstoppable juggernaut, now lay in ruins. Their fleet had been shattered, their pride broken, and their confidence utterly dismantled by an enemy they had dismissed as insignificant. The humans, once considered a minor species, had flipped the galaxy on its head, showing the universe the true meaning of resistance. The Zorveni High Command retreated to their fortress world, a massive, well-fortified planet at the core of their empire. It was a place of isolation, protected by layers of defense systems, a last stronghold where they hoped to regroup. But even there, their confidence faltered. Commander Malkor, the Zorveni strategist, stood before his command center, staring out at the vast expanse of stars that surrounded his world. His eyes were bloodshot, his posture slumped. He had spent countless hours attempting to calculate humanity's next move, but each time, the humans had proved unpredictable. There was no pattern, no rule to follow. "We've underestimated them," Malkor admitted, his voice low, the words tasting bitter. "They've taken everything from us, our fleet, our pride, our superiority. What is left for us?" The High Marshal Vorak stood beside him, his once immaculate armor now worn and scratched from the battles. His face was etched with the harsh lines of anger and disbelief. "We cannot retreat forever. This humiliation will be remembered." "But we've tried everything," Malkor countered. "Every military strategy, every tactic we've perfected over centuries. And still, we've been outsmarted by a species that couldn't even produce a single warship just a century ago." There was a long silence. Malkor's thoughts churned. He had seen entire species fall before the Zorvani, civilizations brought to their knees by overwhelming force. But the humans had done the unthinkable. They had won, not by firepower, but by outthinking them, by leveraging the power of uncertainty. Across the galaxy, news of humanity's victory began to spread like wildfire. Broadcasts, news feeds, and messages from Earth flooded the communication networks. Humanity had not only survived, they had dominated. But this was more than just military success. It was a cultural shift. Humanity, who had once been subjugated, now stood tall. Their victory was not just over the Zorvani. It was a message to every species, every empire, that no one was invincible. Earth was not a backwater world any longer. They were a force to be reckoned with. On the war-torn streets of Zorveni colonies, resistance fighters rallied, inspired by the human victory. Worlds once enslaved to the Zorveni Imperium began to rise, uniting under the banner of freedom, emboldened by the knowledge that if humanity could take on the Zorveni and win, then they too could break free. As the Zorveni began to pick up the pieces of their empire, they realized the truth. They had not just lost a battle. They had lost the galaxy's respect. And that was a loss from which no empire could ever truly recover. The galaxy, once ruled by fear and dominance, was now a place in flux. The Zorveni Imperium, once the undisputed rulers of star systems, now found themselves reduced to whispers in the wind. The mighty had fallen, not by force but by resolve. Humanity had rewritten history, proving that a species could rise from obscurity and shake the foundations of the universe. Commander Elena Voss stood before a gathering of leaders from across Earth, her voice steady but full of the weight of everything they had endured. The war was over, but the struggle was far from finished. The Zorvani might be defeated, but their influence still lingered in the outer systems, in the colonies they had enslaved, and in the hearts of those who had suffered under their heel for centuries. "We did not win just for ourselves," Elena said, her eyes scanning the faces of the room. "We won for the people of every planet they oppressed, for the species they crushed beneath their boots. We've shown them that we are united, that our strength lies not in our weapons, but in our will to survive." Her words resonated through the chambers, echoing in the minds of those who had fought beside her, and those who had supported Earth's cause from the shadows. There was no turning back now. The humans had changed the course of history, but they had also created a new path, one where their role in the galaxy would be forever altered. In the aftermath of the war, Earth became a beacon of hope. The galaxy, once a place of cruelty and conquest, began to shift. Species once enslaved by the Zorveni looked to Earth, to humanity, as a symbol of resistance. They saw the courage in the humans' eyes and the fire in their hearts, and they knew that if the humans could rise, so could they. Across the galaxy, Zorveni colonies fell, their once steady grip on power shattered by uprisings and rebellion. The Zorveni had underestimated the power of unity. They had underestimated humanity's ability to inspire others, to spark revolutions, to build alliances across species. It wasn't just Earth that rose. The entire galaxy seemed to be reborn in the wake of humanity's victory. Yet, as Alina looked out the window of the council hall, she couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The Zorveni had lost, but there were other powers in the galaxy, other empires, other species, that would see humanity's rise as a challenge, a threat to their dominance. This victory was only the beginning. But that, too, was a lesson humanity had learned. Never back down, never surrender to the forces that sought to dominate them. They had faced the impossible, and they had prevailed. And now, they stood on the precipice of a new age. A new dawn was rising across the stars. And humanity, the species once dismissed as nothing more than an afterthought, would be the ones to shape it.